Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host. He saw the card Arna Kennerud and he actually thinks it's not kind of rude, he thinks it's kind of nice. It's Dana Roach.
I just got back from golfing 18 holes, and I'm glad I brought an extra pair of shorts after I got that hole-in-one. That would have been embarrassing.
Hole in one, hole in your shorts. I get it. You know, technically, Dana, the shorts already have holes in them. That's where your legs go.
There's several of them.
Yeah. Right. Well, Dana, it is the two of us on this episode today. What are we talking about in this week's episode?
We're talking about hidden weaknesses in commanders and commander decks.
Yeah, we know about some obvious weaknesses out there, but we want to talk about some weaknesses that may not be immediately apparent, especially potentially some social weaknesses that a lot of commanders might have. I'm pretty excited to get into it, but we got some shoutouts to do before we get to it.
We are excited to be members of Team Ultimate Guard. We used their products even before we became partners, and that made this arrangement a natural fit. I know Matt isn't here today, but he was especially thrilled with this partnership. He loves the katana sleeves because all his favorite products are named after weapons. That's why he still drives a 1996 Dodge Dart. That's the only reason he still drives that. And like the front seat of that Dodge Dart, the katana sleeves and boulder deck boxes fit snugly but securely. It's a top-notch product, and our prices are more than reasonable, and we can't recommend them enough.
All right.
That took a turn. You're like, I have no idea what a Dodge Dart even is.
It's true. You did start naming things that I've never heard of. We also want to mention that if you'd like to show any support to the show, you can do so totally for free by liking and subscribing, checking out any of the other videos on the channel. Leaving us a review is another really huge help as well. But if you feel so inclined, you can also support us on patreon.com. There are a bunch of fantastic perks over there, including such things as access to our Patreon member Discord, access to our Challenge the Stats spreadsheet. There are a bunch of fun, cool perks over there if you want to head over and check it out. And of course, one of those perks is also to give a shout out to one of our lucky patrons. Dana, drumroll please, who are we shouting out for this week?
Patron shout out this week to Dinocorn, which I assume is Dinocorn's given name. Why would you make up that kind of name? That's definitely the kind of thing that you were given at birth. So Dinocorn, thank you very much for supporting the show for a long time. I think this is a long time patron supporter. So
very much.
That means a lot. Really do appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're totally right. This is definitely birth certificate name and not just a random internet username. That's important for us to acknowledge. The great irony is that I wonder whether Dinocorn actually plays stuff like Gishath, and I wonder whether they have a Dinosaur EDH deck, you know?
I think it's like you have to at that point. If you're using that for your name, that's contractually mandated at some point.
I mean, listen, I'm a Joey, and there isn't yet a legendary kangaroo in Magic for me to build a deck around. And I consider that a failing on the part of Wizards of the Coast.
We have a Bloomburrow coming up, so this might be your big chance here.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Okay, Dana, let's get into our topic here. We're talking about hidden weaknesses. So to start off, we all know that decks have some really obvious weaknesses. You know, things die to removal, way, obviously. But also, we know that, life gain decks, they have a weakness of, commander damage could be something that they're a little bit more susceptible to. We know that aggro decks are a bit more weak to board wipes. Those can really knock them out of a game. Or how, high mana commanders are tough to recast. You know, planeswalkers are weak to being attacked. Those are pretty obvious. But we're going to talk about some of the hidden weaknesses now, don't we?
Yeah, I think this was a thing that you touched on briefly when you did a guest slot on the Legendary Creature podcast here at this point, probably 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
One of the things you three specifically talked about was what happens when your commander is in the command zone, telling everyone what the strategy is. And that's definitely a weakness, but there's a lot more than just that we can kind of go into here. And I thought it was a really good show. I enjoyed listening to it, and I like the chance here to maybe expand on this a little bit.
Yeah, it was absolutely such a fun show. Listeners, definitely check out the Legendary Creature podcast. A link will be in the description, of course. It was so much fun talking with them about some commanders that are lightning rods in the command zone, but how those commanders can feel different when they're in the 99. And inspired by that episode, Dana, here in this episode, we wanted to talk about something kind of similar, where sometimes commanders and the effects that they carry and the baggage of all that goes with them means that you are giving away, you're telegraphing, you're broadcasting a whole lot about your plans for what that game will be, which in a game like Magic with hidden information can actually be a really big sacrifice. So to sort of set the stage here, like, I think there are a lot of hard to notice deck weaknesses out there. For instance, if you have a greedy mana base with lots of colorless utility lands, that sometimes might be something that screws you over in some games. But in the games where things are going well for you, your opponents may not notice the risk that you are taking with that mana base. Or like, I play a lot of Aristocrats decks. I love that archetype. And that archetype cares a lot about creatures. So my spell slots, like instants and sorceries, are really precious. I actually can't play a whole lot of them because I need a high creature density for any of that deck to work. So I end up having less instant speed interaction than a lot of other archetypes most of the time. Those can be really big weaknesses that are harder for opponents to notice, and they're all worth keeping in mind. But I think for this episode, the thing that we especially want to focus on are some weaknesses, especially social weaknesses, that are actually harder not for your opponents to notice about your deck, but for you, the deck owner, to see about your own deck. So Dana, for instance, to kick things off with a really big example, let's talk about commanders where their ability involves a lot of removal, like a Toxrill, which is constantly minusing your opponent's creatures, or like a Rakdos the Showstopper, flipping coins to kill off enemy creatures, or even an Ariat the Beguiler that's trying to steal stuff. When your commander functions as removal, this isn't a weakness that you're going to find in the deck construction phase, like how many instants you can run or what your curve is. But as soon as you're actually in a game, there's definitely a social dynamic that you've created that you may not have immediately realized when you were building that deck, and that's a cost you can't unpay. That is a harder to see weakness that we wanted to kind of unpack, kind of talk about.
Yeah, like I ran into a perfect example of this in a game actually I literally played last night, where one player was playing the new Necrobloom, and it was very heavily a token-based deck that was going wide, and the other player at the table, just like, before we kind of revealed what we were playing, had grabbed Piru the Volatile deck. In Piru, when you don't pay the upkeep, deals damage to all non-legendary creatures that are in play. I happen to grab my Dromoka the Eternal deck, so like 3/4 of the dragons in that deck are legendary. So like, I don't really care about this at all. It like didn't bother me. Whereas the Necrobloom player is like, this person can just wipe my board at will, right. And therefore focused entirely on the Piru player. Logically, like there's a reason why I understood that focus, but it created that kind of interaction there where the person had no choice but to focus on that deck because of the thing it had right there in the command zone.
Yes, exactly. It's like when you are playing aggro and you see that your opponent is running Angus Mackenzie, which is the fog on a stick commander. Mm-hmm. Well, as soon as you see that, you're like, at some point later in the game, I'm not going to be able to get successful attacks through on that player if they're able to set up a very successful pillow fort and they can untap Angus Mackenzie over and over again. So I have to buckle down and attack them while I have the chance. I mean, Dana, that's kind of the experience you had when I had a Cardoor deck put together.
Right.
Like I was just kind of trying to loop Cardoor over and over again and goad the table every single turn.
Yeah.
So before I got the chance to set up any of that, every person at the table was like, well, we're going to attack Joey while we have the opportunity because we can't let him set that up. Yeah. And that is a weakness of the deck that I caused myself by putting that in my command zone.
But that's a really, particularly that deck is a good example. And that's a really easy thing to miss until you actually play the deck. When you were brewing that, I guarantee you that never occurred to you. And then once you actually started playing with the players, it was immediately apparent. But it's a really difficult thing to see, particularly in the brewing stage until you actually sit down and play.
Yes. And another thing about this that I want to highlight, when your commander is one of these sort of Damocles, like they're looming over the field and they're affecting the threat assessment of other players in those certain ways, like you mentioned with the Piru example against a token deck, of course they have all that attention on them. I think that this kind of comes up, even when the commander isn't obscenely powerful, as long as it's doing some type of removal or stopping kind of effect, it is drawing attention. And the specific weakness of this, I think, is that it's drawing attention to you and potentially away from other more powerful decks. Mm-hmm. Even if those decks are a little bit more powerful, they're not doing so in a way that directly implicates opponents. So an example that came up during that Legendary Creature podcast episode was Vati Ildal, which is a Golgari deck that can turn things into 1/1s. That's just kind of annoying, and it's probably that deck is trying to turn things into 1/1s for the purpose of killing them. And the fact that I know that you can at any point turn my stuff into a 1/1 and you're trying to kill it, and that's what your commander's doing right there in the zone, means I'm immediately paying attention to you, which means I might not be paying attention to, say, a Wilhelt player over in the corner. That Wilhelt deck is probably a little more powerful than a Vati Ildal deck, but my threat assessment is completely thrown because one of those decks is messing with me directly, and Wilhelt is just slowly doing a value engine. So the weakness, again, is that you are distracting from something that could be more powerful.
Yeah, no, I was, as you were like building to your point, that's the one thing I wanted to say is there's a difference psychologically between something that's a general threat and a thing that's a specific threat. And
yes.
For whatever reason, people like respond way more to the thing that feels like it's a specific problem for you, even if that specific problem might be less of an overall problem than a general problem like the Wilhelt deck.
Right.
Your brain, for the most part, just works in this weird way where like the spotlight comes down on the one thing that's going to be a problem specifically for you.
Yeah. So just when something is a little bit more in your face, it can actually kind of shroud or serve as a cover for the decks that might actually be a little bit more powerful. And like, you know the weaknesses of your Vati Ildal deck. You know that it's got a lot of problems with it, and it probably can't handle all of the attention that it's getting. But it is inviting that attention in a way that like a random Wilhelt or a random value engine deck may not invite attention. And that is a thing for us to be observant of and to be aware of when you build those decks and when you play them.
Yeah, that's kind of the key point here. Like, it's not a reason not to build a deck. It's just a thing you should be aware of so you can deal with it. Mm-hmm. Maybe find ways to abate that a little bit in deck construction, or at least be aware it's going to be a problem so you can like game plan around it a little bit.
Yeah, like I think to a degree, like we've mentioned here like certain commanders that have removal as part of their effects, but also just if your commander's a little obnoxious, that is also a way of drawing attention. When a commander has a very obvious metric of success, or is just again that in-your-face quality of it, and I'm specifically talking about me here because Dana, you know that I have a Virtus and Gorm deck, the Golgari pair that cuts life in half. I wonder if that catches your attention when I put it out. When I start to play that deck, right?
Well, yeah, and in that case, I'm not even sure if I would call that deck obnoxious so much as it just is, if I let you swing at me, there's a good chance I will just die next turn. Like one hit and losing half of your life with the possibility that then you drop a wound reflection or something. Right. Like it's not even so much annoying as I just can't let you breathe. It feels like, if you do, then I might lose.
Yeah.
So yeah, that definitely engenders a response from me when I'm playing against it for sure.
And even if I don't have the wound reflection, even just a single poke from Virtus, and then Virtus is going to make them lose half their life rounded up. So like after a single attack, if I get through, you're down to 19. And from there, my sights are immediately set on another player, right? I'm just like, I've already poked you. I want to poke someone else. Right. But like, you have this innate desire for vindication. Like, dang it. So you see the commander and you're like, I don't want that to happen to me. You have it happen to you and you're like, I want to get payback, even if he's not going to attack me ever at all. And also like the math of Virtus, assuming I don't get one of those wound reflection things, I'd have to hit someone like, I think 5 times before Virtus can actually kill anybody. So that's 5 individual attacks on each opponent for me to actually kill anyone with just that commander. So like there are a lot of very obvious weaknesses for that commander. But first and foremost is the way that it is inviting so much attention to itself immediately as soon as it's there in the zone. And that also, if I poke someone with it, they want payback. They want swift retribution. So like the obnoxiousness of that is the thing that I'm calling a lot of attention to myself, and probably I could accidentally wind up shrouding or distracting away from like the combo or control player who's just idling over there in the corner, Well,
it also adds a layer of vulnerability to you to other players in a kind of a unique way. Like if someone hits me with a creature for 5 poison, okay, I have 5 poison and I can't take one more 5 poison hit, but you're probably the only person using poison, the person who hit you, and you can deal with that. When you get hit with Virtus and Gorm and you lose half your life, then you're vulnerable to everybody else in a way that maybe you aren't from a lot of other decks. It's knocking your life total down to a point where someone else can then one-shot you. True. So like it makes it even more dangerous to let that commander get through.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think this is one of those things that, you definitely generally don't want to get hit by people's commanders or take damage in most circumstances. So like it's one of those things I think you generally try to avoid overall. But with that commander, what I found myself doing is pre-gaming against it in a way I don't normally do. Like, I'm not, from turn one, for the most part, coming up with a way to deal with someone's Ojutai deck, for example. When I see that I'm playing against that, I'm not like from turn one thinking, do I have a plan to deal with Ojutai? If I see Virtus and Gorm, I'm immediately looking at my opening hand going, okay,
right.
I need to make sure I am ready when this comes down to have a response or a way to deal with it to keep it from hitting me.
Yeah.
So it forces you to plan multiple turns out in a way that you don't with some other commanders.
Well, and this I think actually kind of goes back to one of the examples that you gave earlier, where it's not just inviting attention from the entire table. Sometimes the weakness is that you're drawing attention from just a single other opponent. And I'll actually use like an Anafenza as an example here, or Matt used to have Yasharn, Implacable Earth, as his Selesnya commander before he moved it over to a different Selesnya legend. So Anafenza prevents things from going to the graveyard. It exiles them. And Yasharn prevents you from paying life or sacrificing things to pay costs. Both of those things annoy me. Both of those things are sad for me. I like having stuff in the graveyard, and I like sacrificing things and paying life to have cost. I play a lot of black. So sort of like you with your Dromoka example against the Piru player that you mentioned earlier, a bunch of your stuff was legendary. So Piru wasn't as much of an issue for you, and you probably even had commander damage to defeat its life gain that deck was so capable of. Mm-hmm. But for me, all of my attention would have to be on Matt whenever he was playing Yasharn. Because even if there was another archenemy in that game, I still can't do anything. As in, like, my cards literally don't do anything as long as Matt is around with that thing in play.
Right.
So a weakness in that situation for Matt is that what he's accidentally done is remove a potential political ally. Mm-hmm. Even though he's not maybe the archenemy in every one of those games, if he winds up in a position where he's losing against someone else, I still have to gun for him, you know? Like, I'm losing either way, so I'm not going to side with him. He's preventing me from doing anything.
Right.
And maybe I can defeat the archenemy when the Yasharn and the person controlling the Yasharn is gone. So I still have to deal with that. So, like, these commanders, sometimes the weakness isn't, like, the attention it gets from everyone, just from one person. And that still can have a lot of ramifications on how you'll end up being able to play a game successfully.
Yeah, a good situation I ran into fairly recently with this was playing against somebody who had a Lisa Shroud of Dusk deck, or Laisa, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Whenever your opponents cast a spell or someone casts a spell, they take 2 damage. And the deck was filled with a bunch of those kind of effects. And the person playing it played this, it was multiple games in a row they played it, and we kept having situations where someone else would be in the lead, but the other 2 players had to hit the Lisa player.
Yeah, sure.
Because they couldn't deal with the person in the lead when they were taking 4 or 6 damage every single time they cast a spell. So it created this situation where it was almost protecting the person who had the best board state.
Dude, I encounter that all the time with both my Conrad deck and my Baba Lysaga deck. They deal AoE damage, you know? They deal damage to everybody. So it's not like I am a useful political ally to people when I'm playing those decks either.
Right.
Like, oh yeah, guys, let's all team up. Meanwhile, my cards can't not deal 6 damage to everybody. Like, yeah, go team.
You see this sometimes too with commanders that can just deal all of the damage in one turn. Nekusar is one I think of this way, or Perforos.
Oh yeah.
Again, those are 2 commanders where I feel like I have to kind of from the start have a plan in place, because once Perforos in the field or once Nekusar's in the field, a wheel could happen or a dozen tokens can drop into place and you're just dead immediately before you can even like think things through. So you have to have a plan and a way to respond. Do I have a way to get Perforos off the field when all those tokens are on the stack? Do I have a way to get Nekusar off the field once that wheel is on the stack? So it requires you to be looking at the big picture in a way that other commanders don't.
Well, an asset that some of those commanders, such as, Nekusar, has a bit of a benefit that, like, sometimes if folks aren't necessarily familiar with the cadence of that deck, they may not realize that is the tempo that commander is going to play at, right? Where the commander drops and then the wheel into wheel will occur. I think that, like, that sometimes is a boon, sometimes can be a weakness once people are familiar with it. Like, that can definitely be an issue. But, like, that is kind of a contrasting weakness to a social weakness, that is, to some of the decks that are a lot more obvious, a lot more steady as it goes. Like a deck that just puts a bunch of tokens into play. Like, I think that can also sometimes read as a liability, because your metric of success is so plain and obvious and right in your face, like right there on the board. If everyone's looking around at a battlefield, they'll see, cool, you have like 50 things in play. the Nigasar player might be about to do the wheel thing on the next turn, but we don't know. We don't entirely know. Whereas, like, it's obvious that, like, well, you have 50 things in play. And so that also sucks up a lot of attention. It immediately makes you go like, oh, right there. That's probably what I should pay attention to. And again, that can kind of shroud for a player who has a bit more of a sneaky situation going on their next turn.
Yeah, especially at this point, Nigasar is so old and he doesn't see nearly as much play as it used to, just maybe by virtue of how many commanders there are today versus, how many there were 10 years ago when it first came out. But yeah, that's probably a commander that I would wager most new players, if they saw it, they wouldn't even really know what to expect until it blew up on them.
Well, and the inverse is worse, right? Like if you were to just like flat out play a commander and then every turn it's pinging everybody,
right?
No one's going to stand for that. That is why people have changed the tempo on that they are going to sandbag until exactly the right moment. Because here's another potential hidden weakness of some of these commanders is the ones that are, again, obnoxious. Like there's nothing more satisfying than attacking the person who's got the Ristic Study and the Smothering Tithe and constantly asking, if you pay the one, do you pay the one? Do you pay the two? Do you pay the two? Right? Well, there are commanders that do that too. They're like Mogus or Kambal. You mentioned Liesa earlier as well. Cool. Every time you do something, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to fiddle with the life totals real quick. So there's nothing more satisfying than attacking them. Even if they're not doing particularly well at that moment in the game, you still just emotionally, wanna, because they keep on interrupting you.
Yeah, for me, I always think of, like, I've made the comment plenty of times about how it's easier to just kill the mutate player than it is to learn how mutate works.
Sure.
But I'm not really joking when I say that. I'm kind of, I'm half serious and half joking, because, like, there's plenty of times when I see that come down, I'm like, I don't want to deal with figuring out what that stack of 6 cards are that are all, a werewolf, possum, plumber creature types with abilities that I don't remember. I'm just gonna kill you, because like then I don't have to track what is all happening right now. Like that's maybe a kind of silly example, but like that's really a thing that sometimes I do. It's like just easier to take you out than reading all of that.
I kind of feel that way about, I think it's like Saruman of the White Hand. That commander has so many words on it, and frankly, a lot of the words on that commander are actually like there to be a couple of limiters on its power, but the fact that you have to take 6 breaths while you're reading it aloud means that I'm just like, I can't, I don't want you to be able to do the thing. So like, and that's different to the expectation of just like, I see in Atraxa. Atraxa's overtly powerful, but it's also simply powerful.
Yes.
And there's a difference in the way that like we emotionally react, or that we emotionally threat assess things that took up a lot of attention versus things that were just like one and done. Here's one big bomb and it's powerful in play. Like sometimes we subconsciously will glide over the things that are like simple and easy to understand. Like I don't know why we do that necessarily, aside from like it is just like physically drawing our attention. Like, oh, there were a lot of words there. A lot of words, I guess, means I should be more worried about it. That's not always true, but it is a thing that you need to be aware of with your commanders when you're choosing them and when you're playing them. That sometimes just the number of words might be a thing that is causing people to go after you more than they'll go after a deck that is a little bit more straightforward. Yeah,
no, that's absolutely a kind of knee-jerk reaction that I have, and I definitely see players have, where like when they see that card that has the 6-point font on it to get all the text, they're like, oh, this is going to be a problem. We need to deal with it, even if maybe it's less of a problem than something else.
Precisely. Well, Dana, how about we mutate into challenge the stats? What do you say? That was
nice.
That didn't make any sense, but we are going to do it. What do you say that we challenge some of the data on EDHREC?
I think that it made sense enough to me. We could make the move.
All right, cool. Yeah, there's a lot of data on EDHREC that we don't always agree with, so we'll be right back with some challenges. Collecting cards has come a long way since I was a kid. We all have trade binders for our Magic cards, but if you've ever seen someone's binder of, say, collectible baseball cards, it can make even the most dedicated Magic players feel a little humble. But trading your cards has also changed a lot since we were kids too. And as it turns out, there's now a new way to buy, sell, and trade cards called Arena Club. Whether you're buying, selling, trading, or just setting up an online display, Arena Club is an all-in-one platform. You know what I love? They have this line here: buy with confidence, knowing every card on Arena Club is guaranteed authentic. Good! Counterfeits online are like the biggest scare for me, so that's an awesome step to see. Or if I'm getting a card graded, I want that service to be accurate, fast, and transparent, and to provide a full grade rationale and an explanation of how it was scored. And Hey, would you look at that? That's exactly the kind of thing that you can get done when you sign up for an account at arenaclub.com/EDH. Right now, you can get 10% off your first purchase by going to arenaclub.com/EDH. That's arenaclub.com/EDH for 10% off your first purchase. All right, from my challenge this week, I want to talk about the card Victory Chimes. This is a 3-mana artifact that untaps itself during each other player's untap step, and it taps to add colorless. Or it can actually add a colorless to an opponent's mana pool if you want, so you can curry a little bit of favor with that. So that's a cool enough reason to play a card like this if you do enjoy being a little bit political. But I actually just want to talk about it as potentially an underrated mana rock for a lot of different decks out there that would care about having mana up on your opponent's turn. For example, only 20%, so only 1/5 of Nimrus Una's Trickster decks are currently playing Victory Chimes in those lists. And Nimrus cares a lot about when you cast your first spell during an opponent's turn. The same is true for Alila Cunning Conqueror. You're constantly wanting to play cards with flash or instants on an opponent's turn to trigger Alila Cunning Conqueror's effects. And only 6% of Alila Cunning Conqueror decks are playing Victory Chimes. Cards like Hilda of the Icy Crown, she requires mana to use her abilities, so it might be convenient to have a little bit more mana up on other players' turns to trigger the Hilda effect to make more tokens or to draw more cards. That can be a really fun one. Ailey Eternal Pilgrim costs mana to sacrifice things, and that's probably something you'll do at instant speed. Victory Chimes is a really cool little mana rock, and there are certain decks that are making great use of it, but there are also certain decks that I think could make even more use of it. None of the commanders I just named are playing it above 1/5 of the time in their decks, and I think that should probably change. So if you are interested in having a little bit of extra mana up on your opponent's turns to do a couple of extra nefarious things, give Victory Chimes a good look.
I have a challenge this week that was sent to us by listener Jesse Simpson, and the challenge here is for the deck Kudo, King Among Bears. Kudo is a legendary creature, a bear, a 2/2, as bears are wont to be for 2 mana in Selesnya, and it just says other creatures have base power and toughness 2/2 and are bears in addition to their other types. And Jesse's suggestion here is for Sidar Kondo of Jermura. Jesse says it's fantastic in this deck. It's a 4-mana Selesnya partner with flanking, which can be useful. But the main draw here is creatures your opponents control without flying or reach can't block creatures with power 2 or less. This essentially turns any creatures attacking your opponents into basically flyers without flying, make it easier to punch damage through. And the best part about it is not only does this make it easier to deal combat damage, but it makes attacking you much less appealing to all of your opponents. It's sort of look the other way card that doesn't draw a lot of attention and puts in a lot of work. As a way to punch through damage in that kind of deck, yeah, that makes sense. I like that call.
An interesting thing to be aware of, I think there are a lot of Kudo decks that play a lot of anthems to guarantee that their creatures are bigger than everyone else's 2/2s. Mm-hmm. But then again, like 1/3 of Kudo decks are still playing cards like, Welcoming Vampire, which cares about your creatures having power 2 or less. So it seems to me that this is potentially a good backup alternative to some of those things. If you don't have the anthems in play just yet, this is another way to poke damage through, especially if you're leaning into more of those Welcoming Vampire style decks that do indeed care about keeping them to power.
Yeah, it's definitely a card that you have to be aware of what your deck construction is, because like you said, you can definitely find yourself in a position where it doesn't really work if you're running anthems. But if your deck isn't going hard in that kind of thing, it's a really nice way to poke damage through for sure.
Yeah. All right, Dana, moving back into it, talking about some ways that commanders might have weaknesses that aren't immediately apparent, particularly, when there's a certain amount of attention that they draw to themselves. The next version of this that I'd like to explore with you is what happens when your commander is your win condition? Like right there in the zone, it's a big part of how you're planning to win. Do you have commanders that fit that description at all?
I definitely do. Although it tends to not be quite as obvious as some would be, or not as scary, but any Voltron commander for the most part is right there in the command zone, letting everyone know what you're trying to do. So I definitely have some commanders that work that way.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of commanders tend to fall more into I'm the engine that is supplying maybe some card draw or mana, as opposed to this is clearly definitely how I'm going to win. But an example of this, a deck that I used to have put together, is Martin Stromgald, which is honestly one of my favorites. I still sometimes kind of miss it, but Martin Stromgald, that is a 4-mana red creature. It's a 1/1, but whenever it attacks, it kind of has a Jazal Goldmane ability where each other attacking creature will get +X/+X for each other attacking creature. So So right there from the command zone, as soon as I was playing Martin Stronghold, as soon as I announced, hey, this is the deck that I've got, it becomes very obvious what my whole deck is trying to do, right? I'm going to try and make a whole bunch of tokens. I'm going to attack with Martin, and all my tokens, if I have 10 tokens, they're each going to get +10/+10. And hopefully that's how I'll be able to crater hoof, so to speak, the entire rest of the table. Boy, I love that. I really love that. I do miss Martin Stronghold. It's a great effect. But man, is there no surprise, like, no surprise left at all.
There's no surprise, and you're playing in mono red, so you don't necessarily have a lot of ways to protect that commander that is not a surprise.
Yeah, I had a Tybalt's Trickery, and Pyroblast against blue players, and not a whole lot else.
That's about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one right there again, where like your opponents know what's coming, and maybe they can't stop all the tokens that are coming out, but they can stop your commander from making them 10/10s.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like I could not have more obviously projected to an entire table, hey, have your Path to Exiles ready for when I cast this thing.
Yeah.
Like there are a lot of commanders that have, they draw a lot of attention to themselves because their effects are so good. But especially when it was just like, I need to play this and attack with this and have a haste enabler, for instance.
Right.
It's very clear that I'm going to attack with Martin on the very next turn, right? So I'm just signaling to everybody, hey, you better cast your Ghostly Prisons or hold up your Ink Shields.
Right.
And that is a very different dynamic compared to like if that was a surprise within the 99. Versus me just announcing it so obviously. So that is a thing that I kind of wanted to mention here. Having your commander be part of your win con, well, you're giving away a lot of information.
Yeah, it's a thing. In this happens quite frequent too with a combo in the command zone where your commander is something that like, oh, it's half of a 2-card combo, and if they have the other half, even if we're not tutoring for it, it's really easy to put together, and you're just going to lose. I've got a Tavash Gloom Summoner deck right now, but like that began as a Veto Thorn of the Dusk Rose deck. The problem with that deck was everyone assumed I was just running the Exquisite Blood half of the combo because Veto functioned as a Sanguine Bond in that deck. So that was the default assumption that, oh, half of a combo already exists right there in a command zone and we need to respond to it. And you can tell people it's not that deck, but like that doesn't always convince them that it isn't that deck.
Even the fact that sometimes you might have to say it's not that deck, that's a weakness right there. But that can be a social. Yeah. It's just like, it's a Yidris deck, but it's not that Yidris deck. Well, the fact that you have to clarify means that already I'm paying a little bit more attention. Yes. And also, your version of not that Yidris deck might be different than my expectation of what you mean by not that Yidris deck. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I can't imagine the amount of like reassuring or like pregame discussion you'd have to go to like be like, yeah, no, I'm not doing this combo, I'm not doing that combo, because it looks very, very dangerous right from the start. So I guess I'm not surprised that you moved on to Tavash instead of Veto. Yeah,
and I wound up actually liking the play patterns of Tavash better, but that wasn't the reason I made the move. I made the move initially because of the heat Veto brought, and there's more than a few commanders that work that way. I mean, Kiki Jiki is a very famous combo enabler, and you can put that in your command zone right there to go infinite with a handful of different cards.
Yeah, I think a non-combo mono red Kiki Jiki deck, like that sounds like a lot of fun to me. Just making little clones of some stuff here and there to retrigger combustible Gear Hulks or Burning Sun's avatars. Like that sounds really interesting. But as soon as I see a Kiki Jiki in the command zone, I'm gonna be like, okay, wait. All right. I'm always a little bit afraid. Like, is there Zealous Conscripts? Is there going to go infinite? Is there a Splinter Twin kind of situation combo happening here? What is going on? And you always have to be a little bit wary. And frankly, even if you have like a regular play group and your deck contains a combo in the 99, even if it's not like apparent there in your command zone, even if your playgroup knows that there's a combo in there, that can kind of be another Cardoor situation, right? Mm-hmm. Where like, well, I know it is there, so there's a chance. There's a chance that they could combo off later, which means I'm going to attack them now while I still have the chance, the ability to do so. Because who knows what could happen later. Like, the knowledge of combo invites a lot of scrutiny.
And even if you, aren't threatening to do that combo right now, a lot of times those commanders that function that way, if you just remove them, you feel like you've you've removed an opponent without having to remove an opponent. Like if the person is playing that veto combo deck and you keep that veto from sticking to the field, well, that's a pretty simple way to turn off an entire opponent while you deal with the other two people. And then you can come back to that veto person that you've hamstrung by keeping that combo commander off the field. So it for a couple different reasons, it makes your commander a very attractive target.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I had a game against a Gishath player a little while back, and they were totally on board with this. They totally understood the amount of like woe that Gishath can be. And Gishath is not even a combo deck, but everyone does know that as soon as Gishath hits you once, that's a lot of dinosaurs that it plops right into play. And from there, it's really hard to unseat a Gishath from that position of power. And I spent 2 removal spells on that Gishath player, one killing off their Mirari's Wake and one killing off their Gishath. And that really neutered a lot of their game plan. And dude was totally like, yeah, because you gotta. Like, fully understood. It was a great, honestly, a fantastic game. Had I not had the Path to Exile already at that moment, would have been a very different situation. I would have been really up the creek without a paddle, I think. But, like, sometimes just, like, with some of these commanders where it does feel a little all eggs in one basket, as combo decks or stuff like Gishath can be, that single point of removal can really be a huge setback that buys you a lot of room to breathe.
Yeah, like I'm very scared of the Kali the Vast deck putting a bunch of giant angels and dragons and demons into play. But if I hit that Kali with a single Darksteel mutation, then not only do I not have to really worry about those big things coming in play and killing me, I kind of don't have to worry about that player at all for 3 or 4 turns because they're stuck trying to cast 8 and 9 drops that the deck is oftentimes filled with, and I can focus on the other 2 threats. So like it just does double duty. It stops you from doing the big scary thing, and it maybe stops you from doing anything for several turns. And that, like, mathematically, that is a pretty good thing to do in a game of Commander.
I mean, that's why you like the card Delay so much, right? It counters a spell, puts it on 3 time counter, so it'll come back in 3 turns, but listen, at the rate that Commander games go, sometimes the game is over.
Right.
By the time those 3 turns circle around. So sometimes 3 turns is enough.
3 turns is very often all of the turns.
Yeah, and to kind of, at least Gishath and Kalia have the backup plan of like, well, my deck is still full of angels, demons, or dinosaurs, or dragons, or whatever.
Sure.
So like eventually you can just like have some of those out. That'll be enough. You don't have to go all eggs in the basket of just those commanders because they are still more engine and enabler than like I'm directly the win condition compared to some of the others we've talked about. Mm-hmm. But like that is again a thing I want to kind of focus again on with like a win con. Take an example of like Ginny Fey, which can help turn any tokens you make into certain other types of tokens, turns them into either dogs or cats with different combat abilities. Ginny Fey helps you produce a whole lot of tokens in play versus having a Jetmir in the command zone, which is practically a Titanic ultimatum, right? It's just like, as soon as Jetmir's in play, your creatures will get such huge, enormous game-winning buffs. If I see a Jetmir in the zone, I'm paying a whole lot of attention to that Jetmir, but I also know as soon as they have a certain number of tokens in play, I know when to expect the Jetmir to arrive.
Right.
Whereas when Ginny Fey is just making a bunch of tokens, I don't know what's in her hand. I don't know what's going on. So we don't know necessarily when to hold up defensive mana for when a Jetmir equivalent or a Titanic ultimatum might actually appear on that field. Like, there's room for me to doubt. And when there's room for me to doubt, that might mean that I play a little more poorly. And that is an advantage that Ginny Fey can have over Jetmir. Even though Jetmir is probably a more powerful commander, a more powerful card, that is a thing to be aware of, that Jetmir is not giving me as many opportunities for me to make a bad move. Whereas Ginny Fey, a little bit of a mystery, and that mystery can be an advantage.
Yeah, Jetmir is stronger, but Ginny Fey brings the fog of war
yes.
as a commander, where you don't really know what's happening. And Jetmir, you kind of exactly know what's happening. And while it's stronger, the response lines are much clearer than you are against Ginny Fey. And does that offset the power a little bit? Maybe it does. It definitely creates a different game state at the very least. And that's interesting, I think.
Fog of War is the perfect description for that. Exactly. Yeah, it gives me an opportunity against Ginny Fey to trick myself into going shields down because I convince myself, well, I've got one more turn.
and maybe you do. Like, maybe in some cases that's an advantage to the Ginny Fey player. Like the fact that you've let everyone think they've got a turn or two. They will maybe focus on somebody else, and it gets you that much further along on your game plan because they're like, I don't got to deal with that just yet. Jetmir I have to deal with right now, and that sometimes buys you enough time to get all the pieces in place so you can do what you want to do.
Yeah. I like that category a lot, and it's one that I live a lot having a Conrad deck because oh boy, the amount of scrutiny that Conrad immediately invites.
Sure,
but also everyone knows to prepare for Conrad's arrival. Like that's not the kind of thing that can just sit around and play, just doing stuff like.
Right.
And that affects the dynamics of the ways that I have to play that game. It means that I have to do the same thing that Nekusar players have to do, where they sandbag for a while. And that is itself another weakness to acknowledge. Is like my opponents being aware of what my deck can do means that I don't just have to like deal with the amount of scrutiny. I have to like change the timing of stuff that I wanted to play, which means that my deck could very well function completely different than the way I goldfished it. And like the social dynamics at play there are like huge, and they affect my game a lot. And when things affect your game a lot, maybe that affects your deck construction too. So this all kind of loops back into itself.
Yeah, there's an intentionality of forces onto you playing something like Conrad in your game plan that you really often have to stick to, and that's not a bad thing, but it's different than some other decks that are way more freewheeling. Mm-hmm. You can maybe play it aggro, you can maybe play it a little bit slower, you can do this, you can do that. The Conrad deck, there's a plan that for the most part you have to stick with a little bit, or you're going to find yourself in a position where like you don't get to do the thing you want to do because everyone's just kept Conrad off the field or kept you from doing the big damage play that you've been building the whole game up to.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And that can turn into other types of costs that I wasn't anticipating, a tempo cost, a deck building cost, depending on how much it's affected me and how much I've had to change for it.
Yeah.
And speaking of deck building costs, speaking of these hidden weaknesses, things that might not be immediately apparent when you see the commander and when you start building it. Is it cool with you if we talk about Eminence for a little while?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Eminence having an effect right there from the command zone. Very controversial ability. And it's something I've kind of defended a little bit in the past because of the fact that to me, I'm like, that actually is a cost that you don't experience in the gameplay necessarily, but you do experience during deck building. And so this might be controversial of me. I might annoy a lot of people by saying that I don't completely hate Eminence the way a lot of people hate Eminence. But in my defense, after I made a small defensive Eminence, we did get a new commander with Eminence, and that was Sidar Jabari of Zhalfir, the Esper Knights thing. So like, I think Wizards also understands that there is some still creative room in the Eminence ability and where the cost actually is. And I think that's interesting to discuss.
Yeah, the thing about Eminence, for me personally, I'm not sure if this is something everyone feels, but for me, my frustration in games with Eminence is, there's this thing that I am unable to interact with or stop in any way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. My opponent is always going to get an advantage of some sort. This thing is always going to be happening, and I am defenseless to stop it from occurring. And that is a feeling that I don't love. I'm not saying it's a bad ability. I'm just saying, like, as someone playing against it, it makes me want to remove the person because I'm frustrated about them having something that I can't respond to or deal with for the most part.
For sure. And that is absolutely why Eminence is so polarizing. To me, though, the thing that I want to relate it to is sort of like Delver of Secrets in 60-card constructed formats. Delver of Secrets, you reveal the top card of your deck, and if it's an instant or a sorcery, it will flip over to a 3/2 flyer. And, pretty famous that there are a lot of different Delver decks across a lot of different, like modern and legacy decks and things like that. Like, Delver's a really cool, powerful card. And when you are playing a game against Delver of Secrets in those formats, it just feels like, man, a 1-mana 3/2 flyer. That's rough. But there is a cost associated with that. It's not that you have to set up the top of your deck or anything like that. The cost is that you have to have a high enough density of things to allow that flip to even mathematically have the possibility of occurring. Mm-hmm. And that is still also kind of a thing with Eminence. There is actually a cost here. It's the same cost that a lot of other elf decks are playing, a lot of goblin decks are playing, basically any deck that cares about a creature type. It's the same cost that they are paying. But it is still a cost. You are not playing the usual good stuff cards. You are not running Esper Sentinel or Oracle of Moldiah. You are kind of confined to getting rewards on a certain number of bodies. And some of those bodies, like dragons, are already really good. So of course, are dragons really good? But that is a thing that you are bending your deck around. And whenever you're bending your deck around a very specific thing, that can be a cost. That is why not everyone is playing companions in every single one of their decks, right? Like, there are deck building restrictions and costs associated with those, and they aren't immediately obvious, particularly with Eminence, to your opponents. They will just resent the Eminence problem.
Yes.
But there is a cost there. It's not always a big one, but it is still sometimes a weakness that you have to bend around.
Yeah, and again, so it's kind of one of those double cost things. you've created a situation where your opponents might be annoyed that they have this thing they can't interact with, and you have dealt with this deck building restriction to a degree that is changing how you've had to brew in the first place, and they don't care. Your opponents don't care. Like they're not taking that into consideration at all. I've never looked at an Ur-Dragon deck and been like, well, this is really powerful, but they've got to run a bunch of dragons, so like that's not a thing you think about, even though it does impact you a little bit.
Yeah,
as the brewer for sure.
Yeah. So, Dana, coming to sort of wrapping up mode here in this episode, I'm kind of wondering how this makes you reflect on some of your own decks and the costs that you didn't realize that you were paying. Has it changed your comfort level with any of the costs that your decks are paying by having certain things in the zone or not? Where are you at, do you think, when it comes to these hidden weaknesses that maybe weren't immediately apparent when you first started building these commanders?
This is something I think about intentionally, because I tend to look to play commanders that don't draw anyone's attention in the command zone. I go out of my way to avoid that for a bunch of different reasons. So this is something I do pay attention to. But like we kind of mentioned with your Carter deck before, you don't always, even if you're like aware of this and looking for it, you aren't all, it doesn't necessarily register until you actually play the deck. One thing I would recommend, particularly if you are someone who plays in a small meta with friends or something, is let your friends play your decks once in a while. So you have to play against that deck. That's the best way to get an understanding of what some of the hidden costs and hidden weaknesses of your decks are, and like what psychological and emotional things it does to an opponent. When you have to line up against it, it makes you aware of those things, and then it makes it easier for you to maybe try to address them in your changes you make to the deck or in your brewing process.
I love that. That is really, really solid advice. Because, the entire thesis of this episode has absolutely been the ways that it causes opponents to pay attention to the stuff you're doing and the ways that your opponents will respond to the stuff that you're doing. So if you make yourself one of those opponents, you'll notice it way fast. So, that's absolutely, that's really, really great. I think this is actually kind of one of those episodes that Matt will be a little sad that he wasn't here for, because to me, like I goldfish a whole lot, but a lot of these issues are the kinds of things that are never going to emerge during goldfishing.
Yeah.
So to me, this is one of those warnings against one of my own favorite practices of goldfishing a deck, because the way it will be responded to may not at all be commensurate to the way I expect it to be responded to. And there are plenty of moments where I've played a card that I know is crazy dangerous, but my opponents don't realize how dangerous it's about to be. And when I'm goldfishing, I might like overestimate what people's reaction to some of those cards might be. But sometimes there are cards that will go under the radar. And maybe one of the reasons they go under the radar is because someone else is playing a deck that has a social weakness to it that is drawing more attention to it. So that's another thing to be aware of, you know?
Yeah, this game is so complicated, and it's
truly
it's so complicated that there's even things that like you need to game around and think about and consider that aren't part of the game action that are actually occurring. It's like people gaming against potential and against threats that haven't occurred, and that's a real part of Commander, and it's something to it's at least consider. I think and look at it when you're putting your list together and making changes for sure.
Yeah, or in your case, to harness a little bit, to know what it is that you are keeping a surprise versus what it is that your commander is broadcasting very obviously and clearly to your opponents. Because I mean, some of the cool wins and certainly a lot of successful wins, I think, will happen, when it's more of a surprise versus something that was like clearly looming over the field the entire time. So just, having a little bit of extra awareness of that can play a really big role. This game is part poker. That hidden information can be a really big asset.
Right.
So make sure you wield it. Dana, this has been a fascinating conversation. Totally loved it. I'm excited to listen back to this episode because I'm like, I think there's even more for me to learn from our own conversation here. So with that, I think we're going to call this episode to a close so that I can edit and publish it. And Dana, if folks want to find you online, where is it that they can do so?
You can find me online at Dana Roach, and I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me everywhere online at Joseph M. Schultz, and you can find the cast at EDHRECast everywhere online. Plus, if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights, but until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.